Leica brought 35mm photography to the masses. Some of the most iconic cameras of all time were the early M mount cameras, like this M2 right here. When you're looking for a film camera to take street pictures or just add to your film camera collection, you're likely to have looked at the old Leica M cameras. You'll be familiar with pictures made by Bresson using this camera. You'll have seen pictures of Queen Elizabeth holding one. And if you're in the market to buy a film Leica, it's understandable you'll want something iconic like an M2 or an M3. In this video, I'll go through the reasons why I didn't quite warm to the M series cameras, but eventually when I picked up an older Barnack Leica, I found that it was everything that I wanted a Leica to be. I'll explain the similarities and differences with the M-type cameras, and why, when you're considering your first rangefinder, the Barnack Leica might be the one you're after. Let me tell you about the examples that I've got in front of me here. I have a Barnack Leica 3 that was made in 1933, and after the Second World War, Leica changed their design philosophy and made the M3 followed by the M2. I wanted to be able to use 35mm lenses on my Leica, so I picked the M2. The Leica 3 is older than the M2, but the M2 is still 70 years old, but I'm sure there's decades worth of life still in them both. So let's dig in and check out the differences. If you're looking for a rangefinder for street photography, then size and weight are quite important, and there's a decent size and weight difference between these cameras. The Barnack Leicas, almost in every dimension, were smaller than the M series cameras, to the extent that with a collapsible lens, you can easily fit this into your jeans pocket. These cameras both have a bit of heft to them. They're made of brass. The Barnack Leica is a little bit lighter because it is smaller, and I'd say it's less conspicuous because of its size. A common aspect between all the Leica rangefinder cameras is that you load film by removing the base plate. There's a little catch that you rotate and pull off, and a film loading spool that you attach the film to before you reinsert it back into the camera. An advantage of the M-style cameras is that the back opens up so that when you're slotting the film in, you can make sure that the sprocket holes in the film line up with the sprockets on the camera before you close the back and reattach the base plate. With the Leica 3, it works in a very similar way. You undo the latch at the bottom to remove the base plate. It's fitted so much nicer. It's almost like a suction effect as you take the plate off. But as we look at the back of the camera, there's no flap so that you can make sure the film is inserted correctly. So what we have to do with these Leicas is cut the leader of the film a little bit differently to ensure that as it's wound on, it loads onto the sprockets correctly. It's relatively simple to cut your own Leica leader on your 35mm roll of film. You simply count 20 sprocket holes along and then cut the extra long leader using curves so that it remains strong as it's being wound onto the spool. And just like the M cameras, there's a take-up spool that you attach the film to. You insert all of that back into the base of the camera and wind on the film, ready for your first frame. We've got to be careful with the big differences between the M cameras and the Barnack Leicas, because they sound like huge technical innovations, and they make your life easier, but the old versions of these features work just fine as well. The first one is the winding lever. On most 35mm cameras that you've seen, this is a standard feature. You wind it and take the picture with the shutter button. A little less common is what you see on the Barnack Leicas. The lever's not there, instead there's just a knob. You might be tempted to use your fingertips to advance the knob on the Barnack Leica before you press the shutter button. But there is a quicker way of doing it. If you use the entire length of your finger, you can rotate your knob almost as quickly as you can use a film advance lever. A big difference between these cameras is how the rangefinder is incorporated into the body. Rangefinders are fascinating. Each of these bodies has two eyes, and they work kind of like our own eyes. When something is close to us, our eyes have to angle toward each other to focus on it, and for things that are further away, that angle can decrease. And it's the same with these bodies. There are two images being projected. One is the main image, and another reference image with a mirror that angles itself just like our eyes do depending on the distance of the subject to the camera. Now, the very first Leicas didn't have a rangefinder built into them at all. You either had to use a rangefinder accessory that you'd put into the accessory shoe on top of the camera, or simply guess how far something was away from you and use the zone system on the camera lens. With the Leica 2s and 3s, the rangefinder was incorporated into the camera body and it was separate from the viewfinder. The innovation for the M cameras was that the viewfinder and the rangefinder were combined so that you only look through one eyepiece to see both. That's incredibly convenient, and it might be the reason you choose an M2 or an M3 over a Barnack Leica. But when I'm shooting one of these, I'll either zone focus, because when I'm outdoors in bright sunlight, I can set the aperture to f/16 and know that everything between 8 feet and infinity will be in focus. Or if something needs critical focus, I can use the rangefinder to get that focus and then move to the viewfinder to get the shot. Depending on your style of photography, this might add to your workload, or if you're zone focusing, speed it up considerably. When it comes to picture quality, you can use any film in any camera. So what it really comes down to is the lens that goes on the front. With the Barnack Leicas, the lenses are older and have what you would call more character. A lot of them were uncoated and they're more suited to black and white film than they would be to color. The lenses were designed from the very beginning to make quality print enlargements, so the quality is there, and I love the steampunk look of these lenses. The lens mount is a screw mount called L39, a 39mm thread that screws off. It takes a little bit longer than it would for a bayonet mount lens, but I think if you're shooting Leica, you're not changing lenses very often anyway. And if I'm wrong about that, let me know in the comments below. With the M cameras came with a more familiar bayonet style mount for the lenses. You put the lens in and rotate to make sure that the lens is attached to the camera. And of course, you can still use the L39 thread lenses by using an M to L39 adapter. It'll be a case of screwing the lens into the adapter, and now that lens can be inserted into the M mount. You need to make sure you've got the right adapter for the focal length of the lens, because that dictates what frame lines show up in the viewfinder. You can of course change those frame lines using the selector lever on the front. With the old Barnack Leicas, you only had the option of looking at a 50mm field of view through the viewfinder, though you could change that by installing a universal viewfinder into the accessory shoe at the top. This particular universal viewfinder lets me choose between a 35mm and 135mm view. And of course, even with the M cameras, if you wanted something wider or longer than the standard frame lines in the viewfinder, you'd have to attach something like this to the top of it. With each new M camera over the decades, they included more and more frame line options in the viewfinder to eliminate the need of using a universal viewfinder. So which would you go for? Would you go for a classic M-style camera with a rangefinder in the viewfinder and all the fancy lenses that you could wish for? Or an older Barnack Leica, which is more affordable, smaller, lighter, and more discreet?